Words of Joy and Hope. It is the 12th Sunday in Ordinary Time, the year B, and it is the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, 35, 41, and the commentaries by Father Fernando Armelini. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." And they took him as he was. There were other ships there. A good Sunday to all. We know well the episode of the tempest calmed, Jesus who calms the waves of the sea, agitated by a violent tempest. And this episode could be considered a chronicle of a fact in which Jesus has given proof of his divine power, doing an extraordinary miracle. Consider this episode as a miracle. The non-believers with whom we may share it will certainly be very perplexed. But believers also have problems to accept this story because there are questions to which it is not easy to answer. It is important to consider these questions because they help us to understand the literary genre of this narrative and therefore come to understand the message that is the only thing that interests us. Let us try to pose these questions. I will begin by hinting at the indication of the time, when evening came. Jesus spent the day in the midst of the people announcing the kingdom of God in parables, and he and his disciples were certainly tired because they have spent all day on the shores of the lake. And the most logical thing is for them to come home for dinner. We can imagine them in Capernaum reflecting on what has happened, what were the reaction of the people. Maybe Jesus asking his disciples, according to you, do you think that people have understood what I told them? Did they understand the meaning of the parables that I have told them? Did they have any comments, any questions? That is how the day should have ended. But instead, Jesus commands the disciples to go to the other side of the lake. It is something very strange. It is almost night. For what we are informed immediately after, Jesus was never in the eastern part of the lake. Therefore, he does not know anybody there. It is very strange that they arrive on the other side of the lake at night. They have not yet dined, have dinner, and they do not know anyone on the other side of the lake. So the data that is about the sunset seems an insignificant detail, and we wonder if the evangelist Mark wants to communicate something important using the symbolism of the night that often we find in the Bible. A second question, the storm. It is something very strange in the Lake of Tiberias. It is a small lake. You can see it on my left. It's a satellite picture. The Lake of Tiberias is very beautiful because it is like a nest in the middle of the mountains. It is small, it is only 21 kilometers long, and in the widest place only 11 kilometers. Mark calls it sea, but it's not a sea, it is a lake. Therefore, it is unlikely to happen there a great tempest. On the other hand, the apostles know the lake very well, and they know how to predict storms. they cannot come unprepared. They are local people. They have lived around that lake, and therefore it is very rare for a big storm to take them by surprise. Then notice that the distance between Capernaum and Gerasa, where they are going, is very short. Even if a storm arrives, it takes very little time to reach the shore. Then we ask again, is it a material storm? Or maybe the evangelist is referring to another storm that threatens to sink the boat where the disciples are. We know very well that the boat always represents the Christian community. And this boat can sink because of the storm. The fourth question that we have and that the believers may ask, it is said that during the journey, Jesus sleeps while the disciples desperately seek alone to fight against the waves. This is not plausible. How does Jesus rest quietly in a boat of 7 or 8 meters long where there are 12 disciples and is flooded with water because of the waves? How does Jesus sleep peacefully on a pillow? And then he's in the stern, which is the place where the rudder is. Again, the question, is Mark making a narrative about the misadventure of the 12, or is he talking about something else? Let us try to be smart. One last question. The disciples go to the Lord to save them. Therefore, they show they believe in him. But Jesus reproaches them because they do not have faith. All these questions are an invitation to approach this text not as a page of chronicle, but as a parable composed with biblical images. I have already mentioned the boat, which represents the community of the disciples. Let us start there. What do we see today in this community that is the church? What situations are believers living today? I think we can all agree that the church is going through a storm these days. We are moving away from what a few years ago was called the Christian society. Everyone went to Mass. Those who did not go to Mass were not well seen. What is happening today? The church is less and less Christians who go to the church. We are getting older, and we do no longer speak of Christian society, but of a post-Christian society. And it feels like saying that the church will always have fewer people and be less listened to. We realize what is happening, and we try to reform certain obsolete structures. We are purifying ourselves of the naive faith that for so long has held as true faith, and that even today is present in part of our church. There are naive beliefs, pseudo-beliefs, that are ridiculous for non-believers. We are more open to dialogue. We say enough to certain ideological positions. But this effort that we are doing in many parts of the secular world, they are taken as useless efforts and as the last cries of a church that does not resign itself to be put aside. This is the storm that we are going through as a church. Those who cultivate this attitude and see the church that will end up disappearing do not know history, because the church has gone through much more dramatic storms than what we are going through today, and from which she always has come out more pure and more alive. This reminds me of the famous answer of Cardinal Consalvi that he gave to Napoleon, who had told him, "I am going to destroy your church." And Cardinal Consalvi replied, "Majesty, we, the priests, the bishops, cardinals, and popes, have not achieved it. We tried for so many centuries to sink the church. So be assured that neither you will be able to destroy the church. You cannot sink it, as we have not also succeeded." Why should we not be afraid that storms will sink the boat of the church? The answer will be found in today's gospel, which is a parable of the mission that Christ has entrusted to his community. It is a parable about the difficulty the church encounters in bringing Christ to the new shores, there where he has not yet arrived with his message, with his gospel. We will also find in the gospel text a message to understand and face the storms of our own lives, which sooner or later we all have to confront. An illness when everything seemed to smile at us, some serious unforeseen situation, an economic problem, perhaps the drama of a separation that also affects the children. So, how to live these stormy moments in our life? Does Christ have any suggestions to give us when these things happen? Believers are in danger of forgetting about Him when they most need His word and His help. Let us try to read this text as a parable of the life of the church and as a parable of our own life. I have already mentioned that it is about dusk. In the darkness of the night, in the Bible, the dense darkness always has a negative connotation, a dramatic moment where a salvific intervention from God is expected. Remember the famous text of the Book of Wisdom when it narrates the intervention of God in the darkness of Egypt, where there was the oppression of his people, and his intervention in the middle of the night when the darkness is more dense. While a deep silence enveloped everything and the night was halfway through, your omnipotent word came down from heaven to free these people. The destination is already stated in these first verses that we have already heard. The destination is the eastern part, on the other side of the lake, where the pagans live. Jesus asked the disciples to go to the other shore, to take him there where he has never been, where the gospel has not yet arrived. It is the image of the mission that Jesus entrusts to the boat of his disciples. You have to take me to the other side of the shore. In the background you can see the other side of the Lake Tiberias. It is the image of this pagan land, of the semi-pagan world of today. a world that follows principles and values that are not humanizing. Power, money, egoistic pursuit of pleasure, fame. Bringing the gospel to this semi-pagan world is not easy because hurricanes, typhoons are born, storms that are born also in this pagan world that inevitably happen before the message of Christ. It is difficult to take the gospel to a society like this. Storms will appear, and it is important not to be afraid to go to this world to carry the word of salvation. We are called to bear witness in this semi-pagan world. But the paganism is also present in the church, which must be constantly reformed starting from the evangelical message. Also here we have to bring Christ, and also here the storms are inevitably born. The text goes on to say that they took Jesus in the boat as he was. What does it mean, as he was? It does not say that they just took Jesus and nothing else. No, there is a small detail. They took him up as he was. Mark is talking about the journey, which is the life of Jesus, a life that has been dedicated to the announcement of the kingdom of God, completely dedicated to that. And it is at the end of this earthly journey of Jesus that he invites the disciples to go to the other shore while he is in the boat as he was, asleep. We will talk about the meaning of this sleep later on. Then he says that there are other boats. Mark is describing this journey of the disciples in the rough sea, and there is not only just one boat, there are many as the Christian communities who have already been born in the Roman Empire when Mark writes his gospel. Let us now consider what happens to the boat of the church that moves over the rough sea. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The apostles have obeyed the order of the Master, their teacher, who had sent them to the other shore. Take me as I am to the pagan land, where there is a dehumanizing life. Take me, take the gospel to this land. And during the trip, the sea becomes violent, as if it is opposed to this trip, preventing the gospel from reaching the pagan land. In the symbolism of the ancient Middle East, the sea is the symbol of the forces of chaos, the place where the monsters live, the place where the enemies of the cosmos live, the enemies of the order that allows life. And this sea is indomitable. Notice how in the symbolism of the ancient Middle East, Mark has to transform that small lake into a sea, for he is narrating the parable of what happens in the community of the disciples when they obey to the teacher's orders, to take his gospel, to take him to where there is a dehumanized world. In the Old Testament, no one could dominate the sea. Only God was the one who stretched the heavens and walked in the sea. Remember that it was the book of Exodus, and it is narrated there that Moses, with the strength of God, dominates the sea. Also, Psalm 89, the Lord bends the pride of the sea and stifles its raging swell. Psalm 89:10. Only God could overcome these chaotic forces. The sea that rages against the disciples who are fulfilling this mission that the Master has entrusted to them is the symbol of all the dehumanizing forces who oppose the journey of the Word in the world. It is the history of our church that perhaps has not taken into account that when crossing the sea, it must face the storms of the waves that threaten to submerge it. And unexpectedly, storms can be triggered in our life, in our family, in the life of a couple, in the life of a community. And in the moment when we need more to become aware that Christ is with us, even believers risk forgetting about Him. We seek to solve problems as if He were not there. We do not remember about His presence at our side, and we think He is asleep, that He is asleep, that He has forgotten about us. The Gospel goes on saying, Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. These are three very important details: the sleeping, the stern, and the cushion. First of all, Jesus was asleep. In the Bible, sleep is used as an image to indicate death. Remember the book of Sirach, that when talking about death says, it is the eternal sleep. Job also imagines death in this way. Job, who does not believe in the other life, he says, man will not wake up more from his sleep. And Jesus also takes the sleep figuratively when he says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. Or also, as we will hear next Sunday in the Gospel text, the girl is not dead, she sleeps. And Christians have retained this image. Remember Paul when he writes to the Thessalonians, brothers, I do not want you to leave you in ignorance about those who have fallen asleep. The Christian does not die. It is asleep for an awakening to a new day, to a new light. Even the same word that Christians have used to indicate the death of their brothers and sisters, it is the cemetery. Cemetery, koimeterion, derives from kaoimai, numbness. And here we have Jesus dozing at the end of his journey. The message of the parable now is very clear. The community of the disciples see Jesus in the boat, that he is alive, but sleeping. It is the sleep of his death at the end of his journey. Now he is alive. He is always with his disciples, but in a new condition. The disciples should not forget that Jesus is with them and should not be afraid of storms. The cushion. In the middle of that jumble, very strangely, we find a cushion under the head of Jesus. It is very strange, very unlikely. The presence of this caution is not surprising. The Greek term that is used is prostyphalion. It indicates the pillow that was placed under the head of a deceased. This is how the meaning of Jesus' sleep becomes clear. It refers to his death, and the theological value of the whole story is now understood. And Jesus is in the stern. It is the helmsman's place, a pilot who, in a situation of extreme danger, is numbed and disinterested of what is happening and deserves a severe reprimand. And the apostles woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care that we drown?" Not you, but if we drown. It is the prayer of the Christian community addressing to Christ, who seems to be disinterested in the problems that his disciples must face. Finally, the disciples remember that Jesus is with them, although seeming to be disinterested in what happens in the world. The disciples woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." When in life we are buffeted by the force of these storms, it gives us the impression that the teacher wants to let everything continue as if he were not present. And then we ask ourselves, where is God? Where is Christ? Why does not he intervene with his prodigious power, with his miracles? Then the prayer is like that of the psalmist, Psalm 44, when he says, "Wake up, Lord, why do you sleep?" Psalm 44:44. It is what we call the silence of God. It seems that God lets everything happen as if he is asleep. And Psalm 13 begins with a litany in this sense. It says, "How long, Lord, will you forget me? Forever? Until when you will hide your face from me? How long will I be in anguish with my heart in sorrow all day? How long will my enemy triumph?" Psalm 13, verses 2 and 3. These are our nights, the ones we experience many times in our life. The nights of loneliness, of the injustices to which we cannot remedy, the night of abandonment, of the disease, of the pain that has no explanation. They are the nights in which we ask ourselves, is there really a God? And if it exists, why does he not do anything? Jesus revealed himself as a God who sleeps, that leaves things as they are, that there is nothing to fear facing the unleashing of the violence of the forces contrary to life. It is not afraid to lose control of the situation. It is a God that lets go, lets do, that allows envy, rivalry, lies, injustice. It allows them to be triggered, and the events have their own course. We would like to have a God at our disposal who intervenes to do what we suggest, to be to our service, And Christ can be asleep also within us. His gospel, which is himself, may lose validity and not influence our options any further. This Jesus is awakened within us. Otherwise, the storms will threaten us and we will make choices without taking into account his gospel, his presence. We let him sleep in our heart because we do not want him to be upset when we have already made our decisions, and we want to be the ones to solve the problems of the storms of life. And we make foolish choices if we do not have his presence in our mind. Now, once awake, Jesus calms the waves of the sea. Be silent, be still. It is the same verb that is used when Jesus addresses the demons, what dehumanizes the person. It makes him silent. It does not let him speak, or it will make us to do the wrong choices. The evil must be stopped. It is his word that exorcises the evil one that is in the world and in us. He does it when he awakens in our hearts the gospel of Christ and let him speak. We let him decide. And now the reproach. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The fear of sinking stems from a lack of faith. It is normal for those outside the boat to think that the church is destined to sink and perish. We understand that the non-believer thinks that the church can sink. But if the disciples think this, it means that they do not have faith, that they do not keep in mind that it is not them or their abilities that makes the boat afloat on the waves, but that it depends on the one who is present with his strength, the risen one. If the disciples who are on the boat think that they cannot carry out their mission and that this community could end up at the bottom of the sea, it means that they have no faith. The unbeliever can think in this way because with only human forces, a community buffeted by storms cannot stay afloat. If the believer really has faith and believes that Christ is present in this community, he or she cannot think so. Fear appears when we realize our inability to calm storms. The risen one was with them. Jesus was with them, but in a different way, because he was asleep with the dream of death. After this reproach of Jesus, they said to each other, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Here we must make reference to the Old Testament, where it is affirmed that only God has the power to impose himself on the waves of the sea. The metaphorical sea, which are the waves of chaos, of the inhuman. Only God is able to calm these waves of the sea. So, what is the meaning of the question that the disciples asked? Who is this? If our boat does not sink because he is present, it means that the strength of God is present with us. This expression in the Gospel of Mark is a profession of faith of the primitive communities in the divinity of Christ. After having decoded the biblical language of the text that we have commented, we can understand the literary genre. It is not about the narration of an extraordinary miracle. It is a page of theology that we have read as a parable and that invites us to hope on the victory of good over evil, and that we will manage to bring to fruition the mission that the risen one has entrusted to us. I wish everyone a good Sunday and a good week.